As we said in a previous tutorial, all economic activity starts with resources. Therefore, the question of how we manage resources is central to economics. Any resource that's valued for its potential economic contribution is called capital. There are 5 main types of capital. Natural capital consists of physical assets provided by nature. Natural capital can be either renewable, meaning that it regenerates itself through natural processes, or non-renewable, meaning that its stock is fixed and can only diminish over time. Renewable resources include forests, fish, agricultural land, and fresh water. Non-renewable resources are things like minerals, metals, and fossil fuels like coal, oil, and natural gas. Manufactured capital consists of physical assets that are produced by humans using natural capital and then used to produce other things. So for example, a bag of flour is considered manufactured capital because it's put through a manufacturing process that turns wheat into usable flour, and then it can be used to make bread. A pair of pliers is manufactured capital that was produced from metal ore. Most manufactured capital is fixed manufactured capital. That means something that can be used again and again to produce something else without being used up itself. So buildings, machines, tools, and highways are all examples of fixed manufactured capital. Some manufactured capital exists in the form of inventories. These are stocks of manufactured capital that are used up as they contribute to production. So for example, a bag of flour is used up as it's used to bake bread. A stock of tires is used up as the tires are put onto cars. Human capital is the attributes of people that enable them to participate in productive activities. Physical human capital means capacities that have to do with your body, so your health, strength, or physical fitness that enable you to work. Intangible human capital means capacities that have to do with your mind, such as your knowledge, skills, or habits. Social capital refers to the relationships between people and their shared understandings that enable them to work productively. So this includes things like trust or shared values that enable people to cooperate and work towards a common goal. It also includes things like a common base of knowledge that enables people to understand what others are saying and work together to overcome problems. So for example, the fact that most people in society now have a basic understanding of climate change makes it easier to take action on climate change together. So that's another form of social capital. Financial capital refers to people's ability to buy the other types of capital that they need for production. Equity finance means financial capital that you yourself have. So this is things like money in your bank account or stocks and bonds that you can easily sell to get money. Debt finance means your ability to borrow the money that you need from someone else, such as when you take out a business loan from a bank and then you would use that money to build a factory. Eventually, debt finance always has to be paid back. There are 2 types of decisions that need to be made with respect to managing all of these 5 types of capital. One type has to do with the amount of resources or capital that's available. We can increase the stock of resources through investment. And economists define investment not as investing in stocks and bonds, but as any activity that's intended to increase the quantity or quality of a resource. So for example, planting trees in a forest, cleaning up a lake, educating a child, manufacturing a chainsaw, and putting funds into a bank account are all examples of investment. Someone refraining from activity can also sometimes be an investment, such as when we ban the fishing of a particular fish stock to allow the stock to build itself back up to sustainable levels. The opposite of investment is depreciation. Depreciation happens when the quantity, quality, or usefulness of a stock of capital decreases. So for example, machines depreciate over time as they're used and get worn out. When a forest is harvested more quickly than it can regenerate, this is also depreciation since the quantity of trees available for future use is lower. Or the quantity and quality could remain the same, but the usefulness of the capital stock could decrease, such as when a person's skills or a particular type of technology become obsolete. Another factor related to the availability of resources is their substitutability. This has to do with the possibility of using one resource in place of another. So for example, solar or wind energy can be used instead of fossil fuels. For some types of jobs, we could replace humans with machines, or the other way around. So the depreciation of any one capital stock is less of a problem if other resources can be easily substituted for it. The second type of decision relates to what we do with the stock of resources that's available to us. So on one hand, we know that there's a huge amount of resources available in the world. God has blessed us abundantly and given us all that we need to live well as long as we use those resources wisely. On the other hand, it's also true that we don't have infinite resources. We don't have enough resources to allow us to do everything we could possibly ever want to do at the same time. So the economic term for this concept is scarcity. Scarcity does not necessarily mean that the absolute quantity of resources available is small. Instead, it means that resources are limited in relation to our goals or what we want to do with them. Scarcity means that we have to make trade-offs. So if we choose to use our resources for one purpose, because they're limited, that means we can't use them for another purpose. So to get more of one good, we have to trade off the production of another good. The cost of making a trade-off is the opportunity cost. The opportunity cost of a decision is defined as the value of the best alternative that's foregone when that decision is made. So for example, suppose a clothing company has to decide whether to use its employees to produce shirts or pants. If it decides to produce pants, the opportunity cost of that choice is the value of the shirts that it otherwise could have made. If it had decided to make shirts, the opportunity cost would have been the value of the pants. No matter which choice is made, it's important that resources are used efficiently. Efficiency is an important term in economics and it has lots of different definitions, but for now we'll just stick with the broadest possible definition, which is that efficiency means not wasting resources. Resources can be wasted in a whole bunch of different ways. So they can be wasted if they're left unused, such as when you have a worker who's not given enough to do and just sits around all day. Resources can also be wasted if you're using a production technology that's not designed well, so you're not making the best use of your resources. For example, if a worker is not able to do their job well because they're given poor tools to work with. And resources can be wasted if they're being used for the wrong purpose, such as when you give an engineer a job to do that could be better done by a nurse. An economic model that's often used to illustrate these concepts is called the production possibilities frontier. This is a simplified model where we imagine that resources can only be used to produce two different goods. So suppose that all of society's resources, so all of our natural, human, and manufactured capital and so on, could only be used to produce either guns or butter. If we used all of our resources as efficiently as possible to produce only guns, we could produce at point C on the production possibilities frontier. So we'd produce 9 units of guns and no butter. If instead we used all of our resources efficiently to produce butter, we could produce at point A 120 units of butter and no guns. The curved line between those 2 points shows all the possible combinations of guns and butter that we could possibly produce if we use our resources as efficiently as possible. So for example, if we started at point A, but then reallocated some of our resources away from producing butter and towards producing guns, we could move up to, for example, point B, where we produce 100 units of butter and 5 units of guns. This would be a trade-off. We're trading off some butter production for the sake of producing guns. The opportunity cost of producing those 5 guns would be the value of the 20 units of butter that we give up. Any point outside the curve is a point that we can't produce at because we simply don't have enough resources. We could not possibly, in this example, produce 80 units of butter and 8 units of guns because we just don't have enough workers, land, natural resources, and so on to produce at that point. In other words, resources are scarce in relation to the goal of producing 80 units of butter and 8 units of guns. Any point inside the curve is the point where resources are being used inefficiently. So for example, if we're producing at point E, we're not producing as much of either guns or butter than we could if we use those resources more effectively. So for example, we might be leaving some resources idle or using poor technology. The curved shape of the PPF makes another important point with respect to efficiency. If all of our resources were equally good for producing either guns or butter, the line between the two endpoints would be straight. So for example, as you move one worker from gun production to butter production, you gain just as much butter as you give up in guns. But this is rarely true in real life. In real life, some resources are best used for producing guns, and some resources are best used for producing butter. Some workers don't have the skills necessary to produce guns, but they do have the skills necessary to raise cows. Some land is good for raising cows, but not so good at producing guns. This means that the slope of the curve is very steep at the two end points. So if you start at a point where you're producing only butter, it's easy to produce a few guns by moving some of your resources away from butter production without giving up much butter, because you first switch the resources that aren't much good at producing butter anyway. But as you move closer to point C, you have to start using more and more of your prime butter producing resources, which probably aren't much good for producing guns. So your butter production declines steeply, but you only add a few more guns to your total. Now this model doesn't tell us where on the PPF we want to be. So that depends on how much guns and how much butter society actually wants to consume. What the model does tell us is that to use our resources most effectively, we should be on the curve rather than inside it. And it also tells us that to move to a different place on the curve, we're going to have to make a trade-off. The only time we can move outside the boundaries of the PPF is if we either increase the amount of resources that we have available, or we develop a new technology that was not available before that allows us to use our resources even more efficiently. Both of those changes move the PPF outwards because we're now able to produce more of both goods than we could before. On the other hand, depleting the amount of resources that we have available through depreciation would move the PPF inwards.